I would like to invite Professor John Traxler to deliver his keynote speech. Professor John Traxler is a professor in mobile computing and director of the Learning Lab at the University of Wolverhampton. He's the founding director of International Association for Mobile Learning. He's an editor in many journals. And he's currently, to my knowledge, working on 2-3 books, and so many books. So on the schedule there is his link. If you take the soft copy, you can read more about him and follow his works. Please.
Okay, thanks very much. Goodness, right, okay. Yeah, I do quite a few keynotes, and normally I'm kind of smooth and fluent and I have lots of pictures. And this time I'm not going to be smooth and fluent and I don't have many pictures because I'm trying actually to think about something that, I'm trying to think about the relationship between policy and research. And it grows out of some work I'm doing for UNESCO. And in a sense, it's researching about research, or in another way, it's kind of looking for evidence about the use of evidence. So you can see it's kind of complex. And if you're doing research, then you'll probably think this is incompetent, probably, or amateurish or dreadful, but it's an account of trying to gather some data and analyse it. And it's not a good method, but at least it is a method. Okay, so that's the kind of introduction. As I say, I'm going to talk about what I see as the gap or the chasm between the kind of research that you do and the kind of policy that is generated, and the gap and the difference between them, which some of us try to occupy. But it means actually, because we're talking about, if you like, the evidence for evidence or research about research, that it's really quite kind of methodologically problematic. And so maybe this talk is not so much about evidence as about expertise. It's kind of what happens when you put the evidence in your head and it stays there for a few years and something grows out of it, but it's something that grows out of it that is maybe quite personal or subjective. So in part what I'm saying, actually a lot of this is my unsubstantiated opinions. And ostensibly it's about mobiles and it's about learning, but that's just because that's my background, if you like, or that's my work. I mean, so if you're not interested in mobiles and you're not interested in learning, it might still be relevant because it's about policy and research. So we kind of get to the conversation about policy and research via a conversation about mobiles and learning. But that probably means that I have to give a little bit of context to explain, if you like, how the problem develops. And I suppose in my account of mobiles and learning, what we see is a fairly research-driven, research-funded community, many of whom are in the other room, growing up well, for the time being, I'll say growing up in Western Europe, maybe growing up on the Atlantic coast. And we're talking about 15 years, roughly, of history of small-scale, fixed-term, research-funded projects, probably undertaken by, I don't know, visionaries or enthusiasts or advocates growing out of the e-learning research community, and probably buying into the innovations rhetoric of the 1990s, which was a rhetoric that said what would happen, what would be that some clever, well-funded champions of a particular innovation would develop an idea, develop a technology, and that it would trickle down through our universities or through our schools or through our systems. So in a sense, this might be familiar to you if you're working in development, because actually the e-learning research community bought into the Everett Rogers diffusions of innovations vocabulary from the 1950s, that said within e-learning we needed a critical mass, we needed champions, we needed early adopters, blah, 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 etc., etc. Okay, so that's, in a sense, that's where the majority of the research and the development in mobile learning came from, that kind of research community. I mean, maybe actually, again, if you want it in terms of Thomas Kuhn's account of scientific change and paradigms, those are the central inhabitants of the e-learning, mobile learning community. And that was the majority of a large number of small projects, and by comparison there were only a small number of large projects where they were not driven by research, maybe they were driven by educational opportunity or inclusion, because it was apparent not only were mobile phones technically and pedagogically interesting, but they were actually also widespread. They were becoming the world's most pervasive digital personal technology, and so actually some people thought they were a really good way of doing things in remote areas or with disadvantaged communities. And so I can think of maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, maybe 10 examples where actually it wasn't research, it was just doing it. So for example, I had a project in Kenya in about 2005 where we were trying to support teacher training for 200,000 primary teachers, and that wasn't research, that was just going out and doing it. But also the EU had a large project called M-Learning, which was working with people who are homeless or people who had dropped out of school. I guess there were quite a few projects in South Africa with a similar agenda. I still work in the Middle East with the UN's Organisation for Palestinian Refugee Communities, and again, it's not research, it's just, if you like, innovation on a large scale, and we think it should work, but we don't necessarily have research evidence to say it should work. Okay, so the background, as I say, is largely a Western European community driven by research funding, by ideas about innovation, and working with small-scale fixed-term projects. And then at the same time, I guess, what we also had was the growth of the M4D community and the ICTD or the ICT4D community, and I guess that was several different research paradigms, maybe coming more out of development studies, but essentially research communities identifying mobiles and identifying IT as a way of producing new ideas. And okay, we were, I'm trying to think of the right word, we were progressing steadily. And the English phrase is that we were chuntering on, but that doesn't really convey very much. With our research, with our funding, with our innovations. And I think what suddenly made a change was that, Agnes Kokoschky-Hume and I wrote a book in about 2005, and it's incredibly out of date, so don't buy it. But the publishers sent it to an American reviewer. So this would have been in 2005, and it was a book about mobile learning, and the reviewer said, mobile phone, what is a mobile phone? What is SMS? And essentially North America, especially the USA, they could see no point in mobile phones because they had Wi-Fi in their cars, they had Wi-Fi in their toilets, they had Wi-Fi in their elevators, they had laptops, they had resources. It didn't really make any sense. But then something happened, and it may have been Steve Jobs, it may have been Apple, it may have been the iPhone, but suddenly what we saw was maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, the USA suddenly got it. Mobiles. And I guess this had a variety of consequences. I mean, for example, one of them was that what we thought we could do educationally with mobiles suddenly became influenced or possibly contaminated by American ideas about education. So maybe not quite so theoretical and maybe a lot more towards corporate training than informal learning, for example. So some of my American colleagues said what Americans want to do with mobile phones is drill and kill. Okay, just kind of learning simple stuff by repetition, maybe with games. But one of the other consequences, I think, was that someone invented the phrase apps economy, that unlike Europeans, Americans were much more interested in making money out of this stuff. So we saw a lot more emphasis on sustainability, commercial viability, return on investment, business models around using mobiles for learning. But what I think is relevant to this conversation is actually, if you look at international organisations, like clearly USAID, are full of American employees, American nationals. But actually, so I think, is the World Bank or UNESCO or possibly the World Economic Forum. And so also are the many other foundations like Hewlett-Packard or Gates or Pearson, against Cooney, who spend money produced out of Sesame Street. So I think, and this is a hypothesis with really no evidence base at all, my hypothesis is that because the USA started using mobiles, it suddenly meant that international organisations like UNESCO suddenly started thinking about mobiles as a way of delivering their Millennium Development Goals, their humanitarian missions. And at the same time, we obviously saw the globalization of mobile networks, mobile usage, and maybe the increasing influence of American corporates within that technology infrastructure. Yeah, so as I say, this was kind of the increasing influence and the increasing interest of mobiles in development work or the aid agencies was, for example, indicated by USAID started the Education Alliance, I think about 4 years ago. And UNESCO were funded originally by Nokia, and they're now funded by Pearson, I think, to several $1 million a year. Not that several $1 million a year seems to go very far in UNESCO. They started a mobile learning week, which I think, mobile learning week. Okay. I think that's Spanish. Yeah, so that was kind of and other agencies. Well, the World Bank, for example, started blogging about mobiles for learning, and the World Economic Forum published some reports about 3 years ago. It was suddenly on their radar. And in fact, UNESCO they will run, I think it's the third or the fourth iteration of their Mobile Learning Week in the coming February. And looking back at the progress of the UNESCO Mobile Learning Week, one of the things I've noticed, and I've noticed it elsewhere, is that researchers are dropping out of the picture. I was on the board of something called MoleNet in the UK, which was about 5 years ago. The UK spent £14 million, roughly, over 3 years on mobile learning for the technical and vocational sectors. And I was on the board. And that was the first time I noticed that, I mean, I'm not a very good researcher. I'm not even sure if I'm a researcher at all, but I was the last one left. So, I know, Mike Sharples is over there in the other room. He wasn't on this board. And what struck me then was, is it all becoming simple? Is it all becoming obvious? We don't need research anymore. You know, the fact that, I don't know, if you work in education, you might notice that everyone who is a parent of a child at school is an expert on education. Is that true? Oh, are you? Yeah. Everyone who's got kids thinks they're an expert about education, and now everyone has a mobile phone, so they're now an expert on mobile learning. You know, and so you don't need research. It's kind of, you know, what's so difficult? Why do we need research on this stuff? And researchers have dropped out of the picture. And I gave in fact, I am on the steering committee for the AIM Education Alliance, and they asked me to do a keynote about 3 years ago. And I used to, because I guess I come from a university, I felt I ought to be saying something about theory. And it's kind of slightly embarrassing because, you know, why would anyone at USAID want to hear me talking about theory? And then I realised if people from the research community don't talk about theory, it doesn't mean that there isn't a theory. It just means everyone else has their own theory. So, like, we might have really sophisticated, robust, evidence-based theories about using mobiles for learning, and we talk about Engerstrom or Laurillard or even Mike Sharples. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I mean, and Mike Sharples, or even me sometimes, who knows. You know, we might talk about Diana Laurillard's theories of mobile learning and think, no, we shouldn't, it's not the right audience. But of course, if we don't talk about those research-driven theories, for example, of mobile learning, then actually everyone in the audience has their own. And maybe in the case of USAID, their theories are actually something like keep it simple, stupid, or content is king. And so if we leave a vacuum with no theory, then actually you get a lot of other less rigorous, less evidence-based theories coming in. You know, if you've got a theory, do make sure everyone hears about it, because if you don't, there's probably someone from business, someone from the corporate world with a theory you wouldn't really like that will take your place. So yeah, keep voting for theory. But as I say, I think what happened in these environments was that researchers and research dropped out of the picture, and I think that's a bad thing. And it's something I'm concerned to fight, because I think theory does need a place. But what I'm going to talk about today is what's the nature of that place? What's the relationship between what people at UNESCO or USAID or the World Bank or the World Economic Forum, what they do and what we think about? You notice the contrast between think and do, because that can be quite worrying. You know, because there is a worry maybe in these kinds of organisations that too much thinking slows down what we do, and what we do is really obvious, so let's get on with it and we don't need to think about it. And I'm concerned to fight back that. Actually, interestingly, I think three years ago, when the UNESCO, it's called the Mobile Learning Section, they've actually got 3 people funded, I think 3 or 2.5 people funded to explore mobile learning, and they did a global survey, and they published some reports, broadly speaking, for each continent. I mean, they think the Middle East is part of Africa, but so some of their geography is a bit dubious. But so there's one for maybe South America, there's one for Europe. And it's interesting and it's relevant that actually these reports, these global reports, were not prepared by researchers, they were prepared by consultants. And they were prepared largely by consultants talking to other consultants. So it's pretty impressionistic. It's not comprehensive, it's not systematic. But I guess what it does show is that most of the research, most of the activity, most of the progress, the development in working with mobiles has been in English. And actually, in spite of the, if you like, the publicity or the airtime that we get, there's been a relatively small number of hotspots, like the UK, South Africa, and it's almost just that, actually, and everything else, like Australia or New Zealand, far less activity, but there's also far less activity, pretty much none at all, in Arabic, Russian, Chinese, and there's very, 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 very little in any, for example, marginal indigenous languages, like any of the African languages or any minority European languages or any Central Asian languages. So it's really quite interesting that whilst we're talking about mobile learning and pretending it's a global phenomenon, it's actually largely a phenomenon of a small number of English people, of English-speaking people, in a relatively small number of places. But one of the other things that I'm concerned about is the way in which, as the various agencies have adopted the idea of learning with mobiles as a way of delivering their humanitarian or educational missions, there's been an increasing emphasis on sustainability and scale, and that's kind of all you hear is sustainability and scale. And sadly, because there's also a kind of relationship between what is seen as the priorities to reach a lot of people, that's scale, and the priority to reach a lot of people for a long time, that's sustainability, and the fact that there are largely US nationals populating these various organisations, that a lot of the time this means that mobile learning in the developing world, if you like, is content in English. And I find that quite worrying. And again, I think it's something that we need to address. So, for example, this is a program called World Reader, which I think is funded by Amazon, which is why the girl is holding a Kindle, probably. And if I remember correctly, she is in a Kenyan primary school, and she's getting to read Virginia Woolf, who died 50 years ago and was a white English woman. So there is a risk that because it is easy to kind of pump out stuff in English, well, especially as Virginia Woolf's out of copyright, so you don't even have to pay the author, that all of a sudden the kind of ecology of languages is changed by the imperative to reach a large number of people and to reach it on a sustainable basis. But I put this in and I can't remember why I put it in. It's good though. I mean, in a sense, this is only the background to what I wanted to say today. In the UNESCO Mobile Learning Week, they've been concerned to have some relationship with researchers. But it's not actually an academic conference. In fact, it's quite non-academic. But it is the opportunity for a large number of different kinds of people, policymakers, ministry officials, program managers, people from the NGOs, to be in the same building as some researchers. And so when they asked me to organise an event that was looking at the interface between research and policy, I was quite interested not to have just more people talking about their projects, but actually I suppose I've got a sort of concern that the relationship between evidence and policy is dysfunctional. I'm oversimplifying, but there are two different communities. There is the research community, which consumes money and produces research findings, and there is the policy community, which produces money and consumes research findings, and the transaction or the conversation or the dynamic between them, I suppose I'm at least suspicious, is dysfunctional. That we are kind of complicit on both sides in something that doesn't work very well, but we're not going to say it doesn't work very well. And I suppose my suspicions were around, for example, how research gets disseminated into policy environments, into policy making. So, for example, when I've been to a USAID conference, for example, USAID will invite all of their field people to come to Washington. So there'll be, 50, 100, 300 people from all over the world, USAID or Peace Corps, or whoever they are, and they don't know about mobile learning, but they're going to get a briefing. They're going to get put in the picture. And the format is going to be that 5 people will give a 20-minute presentation about how successful they are. They're going to speak good English and they're going to have nice pictures. And I'm very concerned that, and it's always the same 5 people almost. It's going to be Steve Vosloo or it's going to be Matthew Cam. And I'm not picking on them, but that's how the system works. If you want someone to say something interesting about mobile learning, then these are the go-to people. These are the people you get. And so that's not an indictment of Steve Vosloo or Matthew Cam, but it's an indictment of the process by which policymakers find out about research. That people come along and talk about their successes. They don't talk about their failures. They get 20 minutes, and then you get 4 people, 3 people, 5 people, 6 other people talk about their successes. And that's supposed to be the evidence base. That's supposed to be the basis for thinking about what a USAID official can do in Guatemala or Fiji. They're going to be at this conference for 2 days, 3 days. They're going to see some nice pictures, successful projects, a 20-minute plenary, and they're going to go back to Guatemala and they're going to think they understand it. So, and if you like, one of the other ways that we disseminate research is case studies. We produce a book and it's got 10 case studies. So, for example, I produced one with Jocelyn Wishart, who's in the other room as well, for the English university sector, where we had some case studies. But we deliberately wrote the introduction to say, don't believe all of this. It's not quite like it seems. Some projects fail. And you've got to think about the ones that fail as well as the ones that succeed. I think I also worry that what goes on in this environment where we try to connect policymakers to researchers is again a part of a flawed reasoning process. In fact, lots of different flaws about evidence. So that's what I remember what this slide was about now. It was about evidence. When USAID asked me to open their conference, they actually said, you've got to talk about what have we learned in the last 10 years of mobile learning. And my first remark was actually, well, we haven't learned anything. Because we have small-scale, fixed-term projects run by enthusiasts back in the days when technology was expensive, fragile, scarce, and difficult. And we're trying to learn something about big projects that are not run by enthusiasts when technology is cheap and robust and easy and universal. You know, so I think these are two or three related examples of the type of reasoning that the policy community is guilty of and that we're guilty of being part of, where researchers, because of the way they're funded maybe, or because of the way that PhDs are organised, researchers engage in research activities which are short-term, relatively speaking, short-term, 3 years, 4 years, short, but nevertheless fairly short-term, small-scale, driven by a particular agenda, maybe the agenda to produce research papers, and the policy community generally wants to do big projects that are sustainable, so there's an emphasis on money in two different respects, economies of scale and kind of economies of reach. And the conversation, how the two are connected, is potentially very, very problematic. I think so. There are various issues around the reasoning process by which what policymakers in their ministries and their programs fund is based on a very dubious relationship to what researchers do. But of course, the policymakers are the people funding the research. So in the UK, in Parliament, someone made a remark about we're supposed to be having evidence-based policy formulation, meaning that the evidence is the basis for formulating the policy. But actually, if we're realistic, what we have is policy-based evidence formulation, because it's the policymakers that fund the research that provides the evidence that's the basis for the policy. Did everyone follow that? And it's a kind of understandable idea that evidence should provide the basis for what we do, which would be okay if evidence was free. But actually, of course, evidence requires professional researchers. Professional researchers need to be paid. Who are they going to be paid by? The people they supply the evidence to. It's not, we don't live in a kind of neutral world full of professional scientists in white coats. Actually, we're all paid by someone. And there is there's a commercial relationship as well as a scientific relationship, and there's a professional relationship, in the sense that in different parts of the world, our careers depend on the nature of our activity. So they depend on whether we get papers published. They depend on whether we are successful at getting more research funding. And we don't necessarily get more research funding if all we report is that our I think one of the other things we were concerned with in this work with UNESCO was also to look at ethics. And again, there's a variety of reasons why that might be problematic. I mean, one is in development studies, everyone talks about unexpected outcomes. No one talks about anything else almost. You know, they all say, oh, we didn't expect that. But it's actually, if you took a very naive angle that ethics was about whether or not you're going to do some harm, and everyone in development studies says the outcomes are unexpected, then how do you predict the possibility of doing harm if you don't know what's going to happen, for example? You know, so, and maybe if you look at CSR, corporate social responsibility, that's been the reason for a lot of development funding, for example, in mobile learning. But corporate bodies and government ministries never seem to have an ethics procedure. And maybe universities have an ethics procedure, but it's not always very appropriate. You know, so I work in a European university, very remote culturally from, I don't know, work I might do in Kenya. You know, so I'm not sure if the people on the, I don't know, institutional review boards or the ethics committee have very clear understandings of, you know, what might be the nature of harm in a completely different society. Quite possibly the ethics committee is made up of people who don't come from an appropriate discipline, so they're actually biologists, and as long as we're not going to cut up animals or cut up people, you know, they think it's ethically okay. You know, so, but actually the complexity of doing harm in different cultures and with complex abstract technology might be really quite difficult and not as simple as are you going to cut up an animal or not, but actually may also be quite, if you like, paternalistic in the sense that who decides what constitutes harm in a particular community? That community or a bunch of white academics in a European university? You know, and I don't think a lot of the time that has been thought through. And in Western European universities, the basis for proceeding with, the ethical basis for proceeding with research is informed consent. And that's a really quite Western European individualistic approach, you know, and not every community or society or culture is as individualistic as Western Europe. Although admittedly Western Europe is not as individualistic as North America. I mean, they're off the scale in terms of individualism versus community. And there's also a different argument which says when we're working with complex abstract technologies and ideas, that actually signing a piece of paper saying you understood it may be inappropriate because it may just be for anyone, not just people in rural communities in Africa, but even working class communities in England. Saying that you've understood something because you read through a consent form may actually be inadequate. You may not understand it. It may be too complex, too abstract, not part of your experiences. You know, that girl holding the World Reader Kindle, well, apart from the fact she wasn't legally, you know, she was legally a minor, she was legally a child, you know, would she have understood the implications of that technology and the content and the complexity that came with it? You know, maybe not. So for this work with UNESCO, we were concerned to maybe look at that if at all possible. And so what we arranged was a symposium with about, I don't know, 50, 100 people to try and capture some of this concern, some of the ideas, to see if you like, what was principally my worry was actually shared by anyone in the audience or no one at all. And so this is actually where it's kind of problematic methodologically. It wasn't supposed to be an empirical or a scientific survey. You so it doesn't necessarily have the kind of authority that says we talked to 3,000 policymakers and 97% of them say this. It was a lot more kind of subjective and methodologically difficult compared to that. And with Helen Crompton, who's also in the room next door, we are trying to publish a report. Sorry, this was just an illustration of a film called Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee that came out several years ago. And it's set in New York, and it's about the ethical complexity of the African American community dealing with the Italian community. Sorry, he's holding a pizza. I remember now. So that was one of our concerns, and as I say, the other evidence was one of our concerns, and the whole reasoning process between policy and research. And then, as I said, this is an attempt to summarise a different, if you like, intellectual problem that, if you said how many relevant mobile learning projects have there been to your country, your culture, your age group, then you're talking about a very small number of dots. And yet, policymakers are going to ask about the big picture. They're going to ask you to join the dots. They want something simple, universal. Mobile learning will improve literacy outcomes. They don't want any other small print that says only if your network coverage is good enough, or only if you're working in an indigenous language, blah 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 blah. So they want this, rather than us saying, well, we don't quite know everything yet. We haven't kind of filled in all of the gaps. And clearly, one of the concerns with maybe just with education or maybe with research is the issue of transferability. I mean, when USAID or when UNESCO talk about scaling up, they're often talking about scaling up from something small in one culture or community or society or age group to kind of something much bigger. They want to hear that mobile learning will work in all of sub-Saharan Africa, when actually we did a project in Tanzania. And I think probably there is what they're thinking is that handset technology will scale up, network coverage will scale up, and they kind of think that culture will scale up as well, or that pedagogy or epistemology will scale up. So again, they're hoping to get from something like this to something like this. And so we were concerned to talk about that as well. Because what we're doing as researchers is kind of that bit, and what policymakers want is this bit. So, actually I read a in-flight magazine yesterday. Actually, this is because I wanted to watch the movie in the plane, but the instructions were in Turkish, and I pressed the wrong button, and I pressed the parental guidance button. So the only movies I could watch were for 5-year-olds. So I read the in-flight magazine instead. And there was an article about how people who write good essays give dreadful presentations. These were some of the... and I'm conscious you probably can't read this, so I'll read the significant bits. But what we did was... I suppose in my mind, tried to organise this symposium as a sequence of semi-structured focus groups, if you like, where each session, which was about an hour, would have one topic. So this was pilots, projects and their data. And that there would be a facilitator at the front with 3 or 4 or 5 participants, and they would then have this kind of protocol of questions that each of the participants would address. And for each of the topics, pilots, project and so on, the people at the front would be maybe a researcher, a policy maker, a program manager and something like that. So there was an attempt to get some kind of spread, and then we'd invite remarks, questions from the floor as well, and we took notes. Someone from UNESCO actually wrote it all down verbatim, including an unfortunate remark of mine about funding, and we audioed the whole thing and transcribed it. So, and many of the questions, I don't know if they were leading, but maybe they're all, I'm not sure if they were leading questions or cynical questions or sceptical questions, but okay, this is one of the concerns I've been talking about. How do we reconcile small-scale fixed-term projects and their outcomes with the fact that policymakers need to inform large-scale sustained programs? Okay, and I can come back to these. So I've highlighted a few of them. And you can see the kind of, well, I was attempting to construct a kind of progression through the questions. So the second session was, how do we get from evidence to priorities? I mean, and policy making is about, it's about not only what do you fund, but it's about what do you not fund. But for example, how do we learn from failure and success? Well, we don't learn from failure if we don't even report it. So there was a discussion about that, about how the professional system, the university system, the funding system are biased in favour of reporting success. Reporting success. There is an organisation you may be familiar with called Mobile Active, largely in the States, and they actually hold fail fairs where you can come along and talk about your failures. And actually they're quite sensible. They're actually saying if you fail, you're showing, I don't know, persistence, imagination, you're ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. But generally, saying that you've failed won't get you promoted, it won't get you published, and it won't get you more funding. So it's a big issue in terms of how do we understand what's going on if we don't even talk about half of it? And for example, how do researchers in their conversations with policymakers articulate the limits to credibility, to trustworthiness, transferability, future-proofing? You know, all issues about the fact that a researcher has done a small project here, now, and a policymaker wants to fund it somewhere else, much bigger, completely differently. So how do we get them to understand, no, you can't just pump in more money, make it bigger and expect it to work. And one of the things I was saying at USAID, in fact, was that what's also going on here is a problem about understanding cause and effect. And maybe policymakers would like very simple causal relationships that say, do this, this happens. And what you hear in development studies is actually multi-causality, that there's an awful lot of things going on that may be causal and that may have effects. But actually, I think there's a kind of there are some explanations in terms of causality which are fashionable and some of which are not fashionable. So, for example, and sometimes I see this there's an English expression, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're a technologist, you see causal relationships in terms of this technology will cause this outcome. If you're an educationalist, you'll say this educational cause will produce an educational outcome. But actually, if I look at a lot of, the projects I've been shown around, for example, in Africa or South Asia, those kinds of explanations are not the only ones. And I can look at some projects and they would like to present themselves in that kind of way. We had a policy, we did some training, we introduced mobiles, and this is what happened. But actually, a lot of the time, it's an individual who is just, the English expression is bloody minded, who is persistent. They stay there for years, they devote their life to it, that's all they do, and that's why there was a change. But that's that's kind of politically unfashionable. That's kind of like the hero innovator or the missionary. It's about, individualistic explanations are not very fashionable, whereas it's a lot more fashionable to say it was socio-economic causes. So I'm not saying either of those are true. I'm not saying that because that's like a kind of explanation of history in terms of Napoleon. I'm sorry, Napoleon, not this Napoleon here, Napoleon Bonaparte, or Henry V. That history is caused by a small number of important people, whereas different explanations of history say it's all to do with how much bread costs. And either of those may be true, I don't know, but there are different explanations, and sometimes some kinds of explanations are fashionable and sometimes other explanations are fashionable. Okay, so we also talked about participants, stakeholders and ethics. This, for example, this first question was everyone wants to do no harm, but what exactly do they mean with working with mobiles? What's the nature of the harm you can do with a mobile? What's the nature of getting people to sign informed consent for complex technologies they might not understand? How do we work with other cultures? Okay, and there are more questions. There was a session on how research informs research priorities, and in a sense that means research informs funding priorities. And so, for example, it was a conversation about impact. How do we demonstrate our research has impact? Because if we can't demonstrate our research has impact, then what it means is it hasn't had an impact on the public or the press or policymakers. So actually, if only as a professional issue, we need to get a lot better at not just talking to each other and publishing papers that we read but no one else does, but actually an impact on policy. What is it? And there was a lot of good stuff. So, for example, one of the delegates was saying that kind of research, especially longitudinal research, takes a long time, and policymakers don't like anything that takes a long time, and commercial funders like something that takes a month, nothing longer. So what this chap was, I think he was from Singapore, what he was suggesting you do was actually he said, chunk your research up. So you've always got something to say, like every 6 months. It may be longitudinal, it may be going on for 3 years, but just make sure you're saying something in 6 months' time. Chop it into smaller pieces, and actually structure it, the research design, structure it so that something is coming out frequently, so that maybe you're doing a press release or a policy brief or whatever. We come back to that here, for example. How do we reconcile the timescales needed for rigorous research with the timescales needed for policy, brackets, and politics? And that's really quite problematic. Someone, Shafika Isaacs from South Africa, said actually get a politician on your board, on the steering group, anything. They think about this stuff in the right way. Some of the work I did in Kenya, my Kenyan colleagues deliberately cited some of the field work in the constituency of the Minister for Education. Now that is either cute or cynical or smart, but you can see how it works. programs, M&E monitoring and evaluation. I mean, maybe there was concern that policymakers, program managers, people in ministries can be quite conservative. Someone talked about the public and the politicians needing to consume objective numerical data, about using techniques that maybe that were old-fashioned, structured interviews, or were inappropriate, inappropriate for mobiles, or were inappropriate, having a written questionnaire for people involved in a literacy program, just didn't fit together, wasn't aligned to the program or the people involved. And then the business I've been talking about now, about dissemination, publication. Okay, we're quite good at getting our stuff into peer-reviewed journals, although in part of what I've been writing up, I talk about the kind of career, the differences in, if you like, career trajectories. For example, in Southern Africa as opposed to Western Europe. How, for example, it's probably quite difficult to break into publishing, into getting research published, because essentially it's people like me writing journals for people like me to review. And if you're not people like me, that's a problem. Because I'm a Northern European, and there is a worry that we've set the rules of the game and it kind of suits us. And that we're funded better. We are funded to travel. But also other countries have a different set of priorities about promotion. So in some countries, research is not a high priority if you want to get promoted within the national education system. In South Africa, which is always kind of intermediate, because it's in much of its academic activity, it's quite sophisticated, and consequently the government will give you 600 Rand if you get an article published in a journal, but they have a list of journals. So you'll get 600 Rand if it goes into the right journal, but their list of journals is by its nature very conservative. It's because the journals have to become established before they get on the list, before you get your $600 Rand. So if you're doing something emergent, interdisciplinary, innovative, and your journal isn't on the list, then you don't get the money. So it militates against innovation or interdisciplinary work, for example. And actually, I think the South African or maybe the Australian governments have lists of conferences. So if it's, the IEEE, you'll get funded to go there because that's on their list. But if it's MLearn, probably, it's not on their list, so you won't get funded. So it's quite problematic how the rules of the game for professional advancement and professional development are biased. So that was kind of the work we've been doing, and we're hoping to publish it relatively soon. There's other stuff which is difficult to explain verbally, but for example, I get quite concerned about the basis on which the citing of field studies, field work, and the sampling is done. And I try to explain that in the publication that comes out. I suppose I'm concerned that when we cite our field work, we prejudice the outcome. It creates a kind of constraint on the way we're thinking. So, for example, when I was working in Kenya, we would think about citing a field work in every province. Or when I was doing agricultural work in Kenya, we would think about citing the field work in a pastoral area, a maritime area, an upland area, a pastoral area, and a semi-market gardening environment. And what we were trying to do was say that our results would be universal because they'd taken place in every province or because they'd taken place in every kind of agricultural environment. And actually, and we think we're reducing the number of variables because we're thinking we've accounted for the agricultural variable or the administration variable. But kind of that builds that prejudice into our outcomes and our findings and our reasoning. So in the publication, I try and explain that a bit more rigorously. Yeah, as it's 11 o'clock, I'll finish here because I've finished this. Click to exit. Okay, that's what you have to do next. Click and exit. Yeah, so this might have sounded like a very long, rambling advert for a UNESCO publication. And it's an attempt to kind of describe the kind of ground we were covering. If you're interested in research, it's kind of important because it's talking about the relationship with policymakers, and that's where your money's coming from. But it's also kind of intellectually interesting because it's kind of about the progress of science. How do you turn all the small bits that you do in individual research projects into something bigger? And maybe something bigger that has some kind of social, economic, humanitarian impact, which is controlled by people working in different environments with very different professional expectations, who don't think like you do, and sometimes don't even seem to think at all. And so I think it's interesting and important for those reasons, and it's like kind of dogs walking on their back legs. They don't do it very well, but we ought to encourage them anyway, however badly they do it. So however badly we talk to policymakers, we ought to carry on talking to them, just like dogs walking on their back legs. We've got to keep trying.